Chapter 5. Making the Warrior. But the man who most truly can be accounted brave is he who best knows the meaning of what is sweet in life and of what is terrible, and then goes out undeterred to meet what is to come. Pericles. 2 different battles. They are divided by space. One was in Europe and the other in America, and by time, some 400 years' worth. There are few, if any, guns of any size in the first, but in the second, the soldiers have their own guns, and there is field artillery. In both battles, the soldiers have swords and knives, and in both there are mounted warriors. Both are parts of civil wars, and in each case their outcome makes a difference to history, and both set a record for bloodshed. We wonder how the different sides got to this point of open conflict, and we wonder how those fighting, they are almost always men, can do it, how they can stand there hour after hour, facing death or dole out death to others, sometimes from a distance with arrows or guns, but so often in close hand-to-hand combat. On March 29th, 1461, Palm Sunday, 2 armies met in a snowstorm outside the tiny village of Towton, some 10 miles southeast of the old city of York. The battle was won in a series in that complicated dynastic and political struggle known as the Wars of the Roses. It was about which royal house, York or Lancaster, would rule England, but as wars usually are, about much else besides, including the grievances of the ordinary English and divisions over what sort of government the country should have. Some 50,000 archers, foot soldiers, and knights on horseback fought that day until, so reports had it, the rivers ran red with blood. Finally, as reinforcements arrived for the Yorkists, the Lancastrians broke and fled. Many were cut down by the triumphant Yorkists on what came to be known as the Bloody Meadow. Others trampled their own comrades to death in their panic, and yet more drowned in a nearby river. In one of his history plays, Shakespeare has the losing king, Henry VI. Compare the battle to the changing fortunes of nature. This battle fares like to the morning's war, when dying clouds contend with growing light. What time the shepherd blowing of his nails can neither call it perfect day nor night. Now sways it this way, like a mighty sea forced by the tide to combat with the wind. Now sways it that way, like the same sea forced to retire by fury of the wind. Sometime the flood prevails, and then the wind. Now one the better, then another best, both tugging to be victors breast to breast, yet neither conqueror nor conquered. So is the equal poise of this fell war, Henry fled the country for France, and the victorious Edward IV took the throne until another change in the fortunes of war brought Henry back again temporarily in 1470. While the details of the Wars of the Roses are obscure to most people today, Towton stands out as the bloodiest and biggest battle ever fought in England. It has been estimated that as many as 28,000 may have died there, and many more were wounded or executed after the battle. Given that the population of England was probably around 2 million and is now around 56 million, a similar proportion of dead today would be around 60,784,000. 4 centuries later, on September 17, 1862, and a continent away from Towton, another 50,000 soldiers fought near the Antietam Creek in western Maryland on a warm autumn day. The Confederate armies had been on the attack since August, moving into Virginia and winning a series of victories. The Union forces were on the defensive, their leaders apparently incapable of protecting their territories. In a typically bold and daring move, General Robert E. Lee led his Confederate forces north into Maryland at the beginning of September, so that he was able to threaten Washington to the southeast and Pennsylvania to the north as the Union armies slowly moved to challenge him. In the lovely Maryland countryside, with its rolling hills its forests, and its rivers, Lee was outnumbered by some threat, 38,000 to his 12,000 men, but certainly not out-generaled. He came close to winning, in part thanks to the caution and mistakes of his opponents. The fighting, on a wide front stretching north to south, started at sunup, and unlike at Towton, we have eyewitness accounts of the day. A major in the 6th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment described the first encounter in a cornfield with the Confederates. We jumped over the fence and pushed on, loading, firing, and shouting as we advanced. There was on the part of the men great hysterical excitement, eagerness to go forward, and a reckless disregard of life, of everything but victory. The rebels, as he called them, fled for their lives. Great numbers of them are shot while climbing over the high post and rail fences along the turnpike. Elsewhere, Confederate soldiers hung on for 4 hours in a sunken lane while Union soldiers poured fire on them. By the end, so the survivors said, Bloody Lane was carpeted with the dead, and the blood flowed like a river. At Burnside Bridge, a small body of sharpshooters from Georgia held off a much larger Union force until they ran out of ammunition and the Union soldiers charged with bayonets. The Union general chose prudence over daring and kept his reserves back, with the result that Lee and his forces were able to withdraw by the end of the day in good order. He left behind some 1,500 to 2,700 of his men dead, and it is estimated that there were also between 7,700 and 9,000 Confederate wounded. The Union suffered around 2,000 dead and nearly 10,000 wounded. The Union General Joseph Hooker described the scene in a cornfield after the fighting stopped. In the time I am writing, every stalk of corn in the northern and greater part of the field was cut as closely as with a knife. The dead, he went on, lay in rows, precisely as they had stood in their ranks a few minutes before. It was never my fortune to witness a more bloody, dismal battlefield. Antietam was the single bloodiest day in the Civil War, and indeed in all the wars the United States has fought. Although it was not a clear-cut victory for the Union, it served to end the South's attempt to take Maryland and possibly Washington itself. In its aftermath, President Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, and its outcome may also have influenced Great Britain not to recognize the Confederacy. Yet, although the mood throughout the South was despondent after Antietam, its president, Jefferson Davis, said its maximum strength has been mobilized, while the enemy is just beginning to put forth his might. The Confederacy nevertheless fought on for 2.5 more years. That earlier Civil War in England lasted another 24 years. What is it that will draw men, and less frequently women, into a conflict and keep them fighting, even when the battle or the cause seems lost? And why is it that fighting can bring out the noblest and the basest sides of human nature? As we are both fascinated and repulsed by war, so too are we. By those who fight the warriors, we at once admire and fear them, and we wonder if we could do what they do. We puzzle over what it is that makes the warrior brave. As a Japanese soldier in China in the Second World War, even when I gaze at the Chinese dead, forcing myself to look at them until I feel I can no longer stand it, no awakening satori comes of it. I still cannot untangle the problem of where in one's heart practical bravery comes from. Men can be brave out of ignorance, said Pericles in his great funeral oration to the Athenians who had died in the Peloponnesian War. And when they stop to think, they begin to fear. But the man who most truly can be accounted brave is he who best knows the meaning of what is sweet in life and of what is terrible, and then goes out undeterred to meet what is to come. One of war's many ironies is that the things worth living for can also be worth dying for. The reasons why individuals fight bravely or not fall into the same rough categories that those for groups, including nations, do. For gain, to defend themselves, or because of ideas and emotions, we can break them down still more. It is by no means an exhaustive list, but here are some reasons people have given for fighting, because they have no choice to protect their loved ones or their nation out of a sense of honor, for fear of their officers, to win the approval of those they respect, to show off, to test themselves, to rape, pillage, and loot for glory, for a cause, for their comrades, or to get ahead in the world in peacetime. Volunteers who join the military may not think of fighting at all, but rather of seeing the world or learning a useful trade. The British military once came under heavy criticism for recruiting posters that showed tropical beaches, ski slopes, or classrooms without a hint that those who signed up might be called upon to risk their lives in combat. Canada recently had an American deserter claiming refugee status because he said he had not understood that being in the military could involve going to a war. Powerful states, and they have become that way at least partly through military force, often simply assume that their subjects belong to them, and any attempt to avoid that obligation is equivalent to treason. Frederick the Great's father, the Prussian king Frederick William I, sent out scavenging parties to find tall soldiers for his beloved Potsdam Giants Regiment. In many societies, slaves or those captured in war were forced into service. Sparta, where only free men could serve in the army, never trusted its enslaved helots. In the Peloponnesian War, it once asked its helots to volunteer for military service in return for their freedom. All those who did so were promptly executed. To get rid of such dangerous initiative, Christian slaves rode the great fleets of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, and Christian boys, seized from their families and forcibly converted to Islam, filled the ranks of the elite Ottoman Janissaries. Like the legions of Rome before them, the Janissaries ended by becoming the makers and breakers of rulers, until finally, in 1826, the Sultan, with the help of a new, more modern army and guns, destroyed them. Before the advent of modern war, which drew in whole societies and required soldiers with education, European powers preferred to use the most expendable members of society to fill up the ranks of their armies. Shakespeare's great rogue Falstaff, who has newly been made a captain by Prince Hal, parades his motley recruits. The prince is appalled. "I did never see such pitiful rascals. Falstaff is unrepentant tut, tut. Good enough to toss food for powder, they'll fill a pit as well as better. Tush man, mortal man, mortal man." In 18th century Europe, criminals, even murderers, were often given a choice, which was scarcely a real one, at execution or join the military. Poor, friendless individuals were simply rounded up by press gangs to serve in the army or the navy. Or sometimes, as the Farquhar play The Recruiting Officer shows, young men were plied with drink until they signed on. There is a legend, which may even be true, that English pubs had glass-bottomed tankards so that the drinker could make sure that no one had slipped in a coin. Accepting the king's shilling was effectively signing a contract to join the military. Good farmers or skilled artisans were much more valuable to their rulers at home. Frederick the Great said that his ordinary soldiers were the dregs of society sluggards, rakes, debauchees, rioters, undutiful sons, and the like. The Duke of Wellington called his soldiers, who even after the French Revolution were recruited in the old way, the scum of the earth and to the earth. They returned their graves unmarked. When the peace came, many British proudly wore dentures made of Waterloo teeth, taken by scavengers from the dead on the battlefield. In 1822, a London newspaper carried an item about how the battlefields from the Napoleonic Wars had been scoured for their bones, men's and animals alike. Millions of bushels had been shipped to Hull and then sent on to bone grinders in Yorkshire, where powerful steam-powered machines had reduced them to powder. In this condition, they are sold to farmers to manure their lands. Even the worst of wars can nevertheless also be an escape. The French Foreign Legion has always been known for not insisting on the real names or inquiring into the past of those who applied to join it. After the Second World War, it recruited a number of men with French names who spoke with German or Italian accents and seemed to have a good understanding of military matters. Poverty was, and still is, an inducement to join the military. Today, the American military recruits heavily in the poorer rural and urban areas. It is no accident that so many mercenaries in early modern Europe came from its poorest parts, such as Scotland, Switzerland, or Ireland. Military service gave them more or less regular pay and food, and the opportunity to help themselves to whatever they could, from money to women, as they marched along. For the exceptionally determined and lucky war has provided an opportunity to rise socially. One of the most notorious figures of the 17th century's 30 Years' War was Ernst von Mansfeld, who was the illegitimate son of a German count. He first distinguished himself in fighting for the Habsburgs and their Holy Roman Empire, and was rewarded when the emperor made him legitimate. Although he remained a Catholic, he switched to the Protestant cause, partly, it seems, because he felt that the Habsburgs had not treated him well, but also because he was likely to do better in terms of money and land. A century later, Samuel Grieg of Fife started out as an ordinary seaman and ended up as one of Catherine the Great's favorite admirals, thanks to his bravery and success in naval battles. His elaborate tomb in Tallinn Cathedral was commissioned especially by the Empress. There is another sort of escape, too, that war offers, and that is from the mundane and the boring. In Renaissance Europe, upper-class young men offered their services to one army or another for the fun of it. "I have at all times," said one young Englishman, "proudly served as an adventurer at mine own charges." He had never accepted command of a company or taken pay, because he wanted to be at liberty to come and go as he pleased. Benjamin Harris, who fought for the British in the Napoleonic Wars as a rifleman, an ordinary soldier, ended his days as a shopkeeper in London. For my own part, he wrote in his memoirs, "I can only say that I enjoyed life more whilst on active service than I have ever done since. And as I sit at work in my shop in Richmond Street, Soho, I look back on that portion of my time spent in the fields of the peninsula as the only part worthy of remembrance." Before the First World War, a leading British liberal, G.P. Gooch, wrote, "Long immunity from the realities of warfare has blunted our imaginations. We love excitement not a whit less than the Latin races. Our lives are dull. A victory is a thing the meanest of us can understand." Many young men across Europe felt the tug of that excitement. Ernest Sequeira, a young Frenchman who was already a hero for his adventures in French colonial Africa, loathed pacifism, which he felt was weakening France. In a book, Call to Arms, published just before the war, when the tensions were already rising in Europe, he looked forward eagerly to what he described as the great harvest of force, toward which a sort of inexpressible grace precipitates us and ravishes us. He was killed the following August. Rupert Brooke, the promising young English poet, said he longed for some sort of upheaval. When the war broke out, he rushed to enlist, and in one of his last poems before he died in 1915, he now, God be thanked, who has matched us with his hour and caught our youth and wakened us from sleeping with hand made sure, clear eye and sharpened power to turn as swimmers into cleanness, leaping glad from a world grown old and cold and weary. Leave the sick hearts that honor could not move, and half men and their dirty songs and dreary, and all the little emptiness of love. Even in peacetime, the military offers the enticing prospect of a secure world where the rules are clear and decisions, at least for those in the lower ranks, are made by others. And like a traveling circus or theatrical troupe, it has its own values, which are often pleasingly at odds with those of ordinary society. The great Renaissance philosopher Erasmus condemned the wicked life of the soldier, and in his colloquies imagined a monk talking to a soldier. The former remonstrates with the man for abandoning his family to become a soldier and butchering other Christians. "And why?" asks the monk. "Are you so poor?" "You ask why?" says the soldier. "Whatever I got by way of pay, booty, sacrilege, theft, and pillage was spent on wine, whoring, and dice." Renaissance soldiers, and it is possible to think of parallels today in the civil wars in Africa, for example, highlighted their differences from civilians by growing their beards and hair, wearing outlandish hats and garish clothes, and sporting outsized codpieces. "When a man becomes a soldier," Machiavelli commented, "not only does he change his clothing, but he adopts attitudes, manners, ways of speaking, and bearing himself quite at odds with those of civilian life." During the American War of Independence, the inhabitants of New York complained to the British authorities about what happened when their Hessian mercenaries were paid for 3 days. "They are given up to intoxication, and we have trying and grievous scenes to go through. Fighting, brawls, drumming, and fifing and dancing the night long, card and dice playing, and every abomination going on under our very roofs. The need to escape, whether from poverty or punishment, can force people into the military, while others are encouraged and sustained, even in combat, by their own cultures. Values and ideologies, including religion and nationalism, motivate individuals just as they do nations. Religions promise immortality or rewards in the afterlife for those who die in battle. Thousands of Iranian volunteers marched across mine-strewn battlefields in the long war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s, believing that they would go directly to heaven when they died, because the Ayatollahs had told them so. Some carried keys they had been given, which were supposed to speed their entry. The Soviet women, interviewed by the great Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich, all said they had no choice but to volunteer during the Second World War because their homeland had been invaded. Sermons, books, pamphlets, plays, and paintings, then later radio station, cinema, and television can work powerfully on people to urge them into war. Revolutionary France was permeated with images and pageants showing heroism in war. Between 1789 and 1799, more than 3,000 revolutionary songs appeared. In the First and Second World Wars, mass-produced posters, "Your country needs you," or "I want you," for the U.S. Army, urged men to enlist and civilians to support the war effort. For men, war offers a chance to test themselves against their peers, but also their elders. In Germany, before 1914, young men heard repeated stories from the older generation about how they had suffered and sacrificed to build the nation in its wars of unification, and they longed, or so they often said, for the chance to do the same. While in Germany's enemies, Britain and France, young men dreamed of heroically defending their homelands, and in the case of France, getting revenge for the defeat of 1870–71. It has almost always been the young men who volunteer or are taken first for war. They are physically fitter and more resilient than their elders, and as well, they have not yet developed the ties of family and community which might make them less willing to risk their lives. The assumption that it is the men who should be warriors seems to be almost universal through time and across cultures. And while there are examples of women warriors, the overwhelming majority of those who have fought are men. And when rules of war have developed in different societies, women, along with old people, children, and sometimes priests, have been classified as non-combatants. The reasons why men have largely done the fighting and women have not are as much debated as the origins of war itself. And again, the explanations range from the biological to the cultural. If gender differences are averaged, men come out higher on the scale of strength and size, and possibly aggression. But there are many big, strong women who can match and surpass men. The fact that men have more testosterone than women may make them more prone to being aggressive, although scientists are far from reaching a consensus. But there are many men who are gentle by nature and do not want to fight. Militaristic societies, such as Sparta, or the military through the ages, would not have spent so much time on training, which inculcates the right attitudes. If the great majority of men were natural-born killers, women, when they choose or are obliged to fight, can be as fierce as men. The Chinese have a story of how Sun Ce went to give advice on war to the king of Wu. The king had read Sanzi's writings and asked whether he could make the royal concubines into soldiers. The sage said he could, and taught the women the words for drill. So he divided them into companies, gave them spears, and set them to marching. When he ordered them to turn, they giggled. Sanzi was patient and said that the general is at fault if his commands are not clear. He went over the drill several times, and again the women marched. Sun Ce ordered the drums to sound the signal to turn, and yet again the women failed to obey and giggled. Finally, after several tries, Sun Ce said that the general's commands had been clear, and when soldiers disobey, it is the fault of their officers. He ordered that the concubines who were in charge of the companies should be beheaded. These were the favorites of the king, and he protested. Sanzi was implacable. He had undertaken to train the troops, and he could not accept the order to spare the women. The two died, and new officers were appointed. The women drilled perfectly and in silence. Perhaps the existence in different cultures of war-making goddesses, Astarte, Athena, Kali, the Valkyrie, or the legends surrounding warrior queens, such as Zenobia of Palmyra, is a recognition of women's potential. It is also a way of limiting it to divine or perhaps unnatural women. From Boudica, the British queen of the 1st century A.D., who is often portrayed in her war chariot, to the Rani of Jhansi, who led her troops against the British in the Indian Mutiny of 1857, many cultures have stories, some legend and some based on fact, of individual women warriors. Some have fought as women, but many disguise themselves as men, including Deborah Sampson, who was in the American War of Independence, and Lizzie Compton and Frances Hook in the American Civil War, who kept re-enlisting when their identities were discovered. Just like the women warriors in films such as Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Wonder Woman, and Kill Bill. However, they are exceptions seen as outside the normal order of things, where war is the male sphere. We used to assume that the Amazons were legendary, despite accounts by the ancient Greeks which placed them somewhere in Asia Minor. The Greeks were fascinated and horrified by the stories of such unnatural women who were reputed to cut off their breasts in order to pull their bows better and to cripple their own male children. The Amazons were said to have fought successfully in battle against men, until the right order was at last restored and they were defeated. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that the Amazons were not a fable believed by the ancient Greeks. Since it is now possible for archaeologists to determine the sex of skeletons, a lot of what has been assumed to be male warriors have had to be reclassified as women. Among the nomadic horse-riding warrior peoples from the steppes, whom the Greeks called Scythians, women appear to have been the equals of men even when it came to fighting, and in death they lie with their weapons. Perhaps as many as 37% of Scythian burials are of women warriors. Tombs of Viking women warriors from a later period have been found as well. The west coast of Africa produced a modern-day equivalent to the Amazons in Dahomey, a state whose wealth and power came from slave trading and its highly militarized society. The Victorian traveler Richard Burton, who visited in 1863, described it as this small black Sparta, and was struck by its elite corps of women warriors in the early 1700s. So it is said, a ruler was short of men for his army, so he dressed a company of women in uniform to deceive his enemies. His pretense became actual as the women turned out to be a highly effective palace guard and combat troops. They may have made up as much as a third of the king's forces. The women were physically tough, well-disciplined, and armed with muskets and later rifles. They were reputed to be ferocious and implacable and much better fighters than the men. In Dahomey's last battles in the second half of the 19th century, the women warriors fought to the bitter end. They were remarkable for their courage and their ferocity, said a French marine, and threw themselves against the French bayonets with prodigious bravery. We remember such women warriors because they have been so rare in history. When women have been active participants in war, it has more often been as mistresses or wives, accompanying their men as nurses, cooks, or purveyors of food or sex. The Spanish army in the Netherlands in the 16th century had 400 mounted prostitutes and another 400 on foot. In the American Civil War, the women who accompanied the Union General Joseph Hooker's Army of the Potomac generated a new word for prostitutes. Anglo-Saxon armies have been squeamish about official brothels, partly because of pressure from society. Although the Indian Army ran them quietly on the side, the French army long had them as a matter of course. At the siege of Dien Bien Phu in Indochina in 1953, when a French force was surrounded by the Vietnamese nationalists, the Viet Minh, 2 mobile field brothels made up of women from Algeria and Morocco were trapped along with the defenders and ended by sharing in the nursing of the soldiers. Often, as with the euphemistically named comfort women, under the Japanese occupations of Korea and China, the women were forced into prostitution. In Europe's early modern wars, the camp followers, and they could include men as well, often formed a long tail for relatively small forces. A Spanish force besieging the Dutch town of Bergen-op-Zoom in 1622 was said a local. Such a small army, with so many carts, baggage, horse nags, sutlers, lackeys, women, children, and a rabble which numbered far more than the army itself. The authorities often tried to limit the numbers, but until armies could provide their own supplies, they were forced to allow the private suppliers. Moreover, it was almost impossible to prevent desperate women from following the armies. If their men abandoned them, they and their children would probably die. If the men themselves died in battle or of disease, the women would have to find other husbands or protectors as quickly as possible. Although she came from a different social class to many of the camp followers, the Spaniard Juana Smith was equally vulnerable with. When she met her husband Harry during Wellington's campaigns in Spain, she was 14, penniless. Her family was Spanish aristocracy, but had been ruined by the French invasion and subsequent war and alone in the world except for an older sister. He was a British officer who, impetuous in this, as well as in battle, fell madly in love with her. By marrying Harry, she gained a protector, at least while he lived, which for a young officer at the time was not likely to be long. But she cut herself off from her compatriots by marrying a Protestant. The marriage, most improbably, turned out to be a long and exceedingly happy one. Juana followed her husband through Spain, sharing the hardships of the campaign as Wellington drove Napoleon's armies northward, and she scoured the battlefields at Vittoria and then Waterloo to find him once the guns had fallen silent. She was with him when he fought in India and then in South Africa, where the city of Ladysmith is named after her, While women have moved into other formerly male spheres in the 20th century, armed forces have been slow to accept them as equals and use them in combat. The reluctance, or perhaps it is more accurate to call it resistance, has drawn on various arguments that women are by nature nurturers, not warriors, that their presence on the battlefield might be bad for discipline, as the men in their unit try to protect them, or that they are physically and temperamentally unfitted for the rigors of war. Or perhaps what really matters is that men fear that admitting women will destroy a cozy club. American male Marines, said a woman officer, felt that the presence of women would make it impossible for them any longer to fart, burp, tell raunchy jokes, walk around naked, swap sex stories, wrestle, and simply be young men together. Why are you women? A teammate from a U.S. Special Operations Unit asked a female colleague. Trying to destroy the last good thing we men have left. In recent decades, most Western armies have gradually incorporated women as regular troops. But old attitudes die hard. In the 1990s, an officer in the Russian Navy greeted the first woman cadet to be admitted to its naval academy with one girl alone. Cannot ruin the Navy. American women going into the Marines, perhaps the toughest of all the services, have encountered hostility and misogyny, even sexual abuse. And often hostility has come from society at large. Women in uniform have been seen contradictorily as either sexless or oversexed. The British in the First World War eliminated the breast pocket on women's uniforms for fear it would call attention to the real thing underneath. In the Second World War, a whispering campaign accused members of the American Women's Army Corps, the WACs, of being little better than prostitutes. Many of the women warriors Alexievich spoke to found that when they came home, women who had not fought accused them of going off to the front to chase men. We know what you did there. Women warriors have also struggled against the perception that they are softer than men. One of the comments that stood out for me during my REES lectures on war came from a young woman officer at York. She was the mother of 2 small children, but she said when she was deployed to Afghanistan, she forced herself not to think about them while she was there. Her unit had an anthrax scare, and they were all given injections, along with a warning that this might make women infertile again. She said she simply could not think about it. The auditorium was completely silent. The demands of mass war in the 20th century meant that women had to be allowed into the armed forces. But typically, they were assigned to non-combat roles as nurses or clerks, driving vehicles or ferrying planes. The British discovered that women recruits were good at the painstaking work of reading aerial photography, perhaps as one officer suggested, because they had experience in fine needlework. Even the Nazis, who had made such play of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, as women's proper sphere, found they had to call them into service. In the Second World War, by 1945, there were 500,000 women in the German armed forces in support roles. There were probably double that number in the Soviet forces. The Soviet authorities had always talked in peacetime about the equality of men and women, although the reality was rather different. But it was the devastating losses of men suffered during the German invasion that brought women into the armed forces, many of them as volunteers. Soviet women were at the front as medical staff, but also as combatants, anti-aircraft gunners, partisans behind the German lines, infantry, tank crew, and pilots. The Soviet Air Force had 3 all-women units, of which the most famous was a bomber regiment nicknamed by the Germans the Night Witches. Soviet men found their presence unsettling at first, partly because so many of the women were so young, and partly because their presence reminded them of home. Olga, a medical assistant interviewed by Alexievich, Remembered once during the night, I sat by a dugout and began to sing softly. I thought everyone was asleep and no one would hear me. But in the morning, the commander said to me, "We didn't sleep." Such longing for a woman's voice. The male commander of an anti-aircraft regiment initially said that women could not fit in. Military affairs from time immemorial had been considered men's work. What is more, the shells were too heavy for women to carry. Their presence in the same dugout would be disturbing for the men. Everyone knew that sitting on the metal control seats for hours on end was bad for women. And where finally would they wash and dry their hair? The needs of war forced both the women and the men in the unit to adapt. "We walked a hard path together," said one woman. The Germans were often particularly brutal to captured Soviet women soldiers, parading them to show how they were monsters or shooting them out of hand. The women warriors kept 2 bullets handy, one to kill themselves before the Germans could, and the second in case the first misfired. Some 27,000 Soviet women also fought as guerrillas against the Germans, and in Italy, it is said 35,000 women were in the partisans during the Second World War, and some were killed in fighting. Women fought and died in Yugoslavia, Greece, Poland, and Denmark. The French resistance tended to limit women to supporting roles, partly because the Gaullist Free French did not approve of giving guns to women, or, as one male member of the resistance told the British, if women must be used, then it is preferable to use older women, less likely to be a source of temptation to colleagues. From 1943, the formidable Maquis, which fought first in the mountains and hills of southeastern France, dispensed with women altogether. Since 1945, women have continued to fight in guerrilla wars against foreign occupiers or their own governments. But when the fighting has stopped, their contributions have often been downplayed or written out of the history. When the Sandinistas won in Nicaragua in 1979, most women were demobilized or moved to women-only units after the Algerian War of Independence. The women who fought were not given pensions. Biology is clearly not a sufficient explanation for the long-standing gender differences, which are only now sporadically and fitfully starting to change. Given the profound influences war and society have had on each other, we cannot ignore the ways in which war has shaped our understanding of what men and women should be. We know that culture, in its broadest sense of the values and beliefs a society holds dear, and which help to keep it together, shapes humans as much as or more than biology. We hold such expectations before our young, and we educate them in our ways. War and masculinity have a long and intimate relationship in much of human history, and we have tended to see woman's work as centered around the home and the family. In the Iliad, Hector parts with his wife Andromache as he goes to fight the Greeks, saying, "So please go home and tend to your own tasks, the distaff and the loom, and keep the women working hard, as well as for the fighting men will see to that." "All who were born in Troy, but I, most of all," Mussolini declared. War is to men what maternity is to women. Fascists have been particularly enamored of traditional gender roles. Vichy France made Mother's Day a major festival and awarded medals to good mothers. Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, argued that man should be trained as a warrior and woman as recreation for the warrior, a precept he put into practice in his own life. As far as the recreation was concerned, he also said sanctimoniously, "If we eliminate women from every realm of public life, we do it not in order to dishonor her, but in order that her honor may be restored to her." Such attitudes have not gone away even in more liberal societies. If men's views on women as warriors are ambivalent, so too are women's. Successive waves of feminists have been uncomfortable with discussion of women fighting, preferring to see war as something men do. Jean Beth L. Stein, a philosopher who, among much else, explored gender roles in war, was struck by a special issue of the Women's Studies International Forum, which, as its name indicates, exists to encourage feminist research. The topic announced women and men's wars, she reflected, encourages women to turn away war's men's. Men are the historic authors of organized violence. Yes, women have been drawn in, and they have been required to observe, suffer, cope, mourn, honor, adore, witness, work. But men have done the describing and defining of war, and the women are affected by it. They mostly react. While there has been considerable research into the impact of war on women, there is comparatively little on women as warriors or on the broader topic of gender and war. Yet in so many societies in the past and now, boys are told to be men. And part of that is showing the sorts of qualities we associate with warriors. As they grow up, they endure rituals, often painful ones, to initiate them into manhood. As children, boys are given toy weapons, little uniforms, or war games. In 19th century Europe, conscription was often called the school of manliness. Far more than women, men learn to fear being cowards. Being accused of behaving like a woman carries connotations of emotionalism and weakness. In military training, even today in modern societies, sergeants and officers shame new recruits by calling them pussy or girl. So for women to fight alongside men threatens to undermine notions of what it is to be a man. As a non-commissioned officer from the elite U.S. Navy SEALs motto, "The only easy day was yesterday," put it, these guys were raised to think that girls were weaker and inferior, and put all their identity and manhood in what they do. So when these guys see women in the field, they panic, thinking, "Oh my God, what does that make me?" Women have played a part in the making of the male warrior. She was convinced she had loved a coward, said an American woman during the Second World War when she received a letter from her boyfriend in which he admitted that he wept during heavy fighting. "I never wrote to him again," like the Spartan mothers in classical Greece, or the women in the First World War who handed out white feathers to men of military age who were not in uniform. Women have urged men to fight and shamed them for refusing. In different cultures, women have taunted men by stripping naked or exposing their genitals to mock what they perceive as male cowardice. During the left-wing government of Salvador Allende in Chile, some of his conservative women opponents threw corn at the military because they were chickens afraid to remove him from office. Women have opposed war, sometimes on the grounds that they create life and do not take it away. But they have also been its cheerleaders. "Do not think I am crying because my 2 older sons are dead," said a Bulgarian mother in the early 20th century. "I'm crying because the 2 younger boys are not old enough to go and help drive out the Turks." In 19th century Prussia, patriotic women raised funds to build battleships. Those militant suffragists, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, swung around after 1914 from demanding votes for women to supporting the war effort wholeheartedly, including the conscription of men in the First World War. A letter by a woman who described herself as a little mother with a message to pacifists appeared in 1916 in the mass circulation British paper by the Morning Post and sold 70,000 copies in under a week when it was reprinted as a pamphlet. "British women," she said, as mothers of the men who were fighting to uphold the honor and traditions of the empire, would not tolerate calls for peace. "There is only one temperature for women of the British race, and that is white heat. We women," she went on, "pass on the ammunition of the only sons to fill up the gaps." Women, gentle, nurtured, and timid, had not wanted the war. But they had risen to their responsibility. "We've fetched our laddie from school. We've put his cap away." If, she concluded proudly, their sons did not come back, British women would have the glorious memories of their men. As Virginia Woolf wrote in A Room of One's Own, women have served all these centuries as looking glasses, possessing the magic and delicious power of reflecting the figure of man at twice its natural size. Without that power, probably the earth would still be swamp and jungle. The glories of all our wars would be unknown. We should still be scratching the outlines of deer on the remains of mutton bones and bartering flints for sheepskins or whatever simple ornament took our unsophisticated taste. Supermen and fingers of destiny would never have existed. The Tsar and the Kaiser would never have worn crowns or lost them. Whatever may be their use in civilized societies, mirrors are essential to all violent and heroic action. That is why Napoleon and Mussolini both insist so emphatically upon the inferiority of women. For if they were not inferior, they would cease to enlarge. That serves to explain, in part, the necessity that women so often are to men. That Western exemplar of the great warrior Achilles, who was trained from childhood to become, above all, a superb killing machine, turned to his mother, the sea nymph Thetis, to help in his pain and anger. When Agamemnon, commander of the Greek invaders of Troy, humiliated him, she promised him revenge and provided him with a special suit of armor. And there have been many parallels to Achilles in real life. Julian Grenfell came from an old aristocratic English family. He, his brother Billy, and his two Grenfell cousins grew up before the First World War in great houses where visitors included prime ministers, leading writers, royalty, and distinguished officers. Grenfells were good at fighting and hunting, itself a preparation for war, at least of the old style. The family tree included admirals and generals, and one field marshal, Grenfells, won medals for bravery, and Grenfells died bravely in Britain's wars around the world. When the First World War started, Julian was in South Africa, desperate to get back to Europe to join in the fighting. "It is horrible being tucked away here at a time like this," he wrote to his mother, Lady Desborough. "It must be wonderful in England now." When he reached the trenches on the Western Front, he wrote extraordinarily open letters to her about the experience of soldiering, his fears of being a coward, and the thrill of battle. She circulated them proudly to her friends and persuaded the editor of the Times to publish them anonymously. The most important thing for the Duke of Wellington was not that his officers could read a map or understand how a gun worked. It was that they should be brave. Before 1914, English public schools, their families and their friends taught that lesson to middle and upper-class boys like Grenfell and his cousins. They were to learn to keep their upper lips stiff and their emotions well under control. If death came for them, they must face it bravely in great struggles like the First and Second World Wars. It was almost unthinkable not to go when everyone about was enlisting and when civilians looked askance at men of military age who were not in uniform. "It was not courage or his own initiative," said one Englishman, "that led him to the front in France in the First World War. On the contrary, I have been carried along on the crest of the world's event. That is all. It is weakness, the inability to resist the tide of time. No, it is not weakness, it is youth. Cultures need heroes, and so often the most vivid in our imaginations are the warriors. Hector, Achilles, Genghis Khan, Lancelot, Robert the Bruce, Julius Caesar, Baber, Frederick the Great, Napoleon, Baron von Richthofen, Geronimo, Richard the Lionheart, Saladin. The Old Testament is filled with stories of great warriors: Joshua, Gideon, David. We all have our own lists, but heroes cross cultural boundaries. Alexander the Great started his invasion of Asia by laying wreaths on what he supposed was the tomb of Achilles. Napoleon dreamed of Alexander when he invaded Egypt, and the unfortunate Napoleon III, his nephew, tried to emulate his great-uncle by commanding his own troops in the Franco-Prussian War, and so led them to disaster at Sedan. 19th-century Europe rediscovered the Middle Ages, and part of what attracted it was the image of the noble knight in armor, prepared to battle and die for his own honor and that of his lady. An Austrian Army Handbook of 1889 read the strict interpretation of military honor, ennobles the officer corps in its entirety, and endows it with the character of knighthood. As a young soldier called Huntley Gordon leaned on the rail of the ship carrying him to France in 1914, his companion quoted lines from Shakespeare's Henry V. "Now, lords, for France the enterprise whereof shall be to you as us, like glorious." The young men who went off to war in 1914, whether they came from the great cities of Europe or the remoter parts of Canada or Australia, had been brought up on the classic myths and epics on great literature, popular novels such as The Three Musketeers, or the seemingly endless succession of boys. Adventure stories. War can offer adventure. It has also been a business, often a very profitable one. Mercenaries, freelancers, as they were once known after their weapons or guns for hire, have an ancient and frequently dishonorable history. In the 13th and 14th centuries, bands of armed men roamed Italy, hiring themselves out to prosperous city-states for their struggles with their neighbors. Some were local men, while others had drifted down over the Alps, veterans, perhaps from the Crusades or dynastic wars, with few skills beyond fighting. Their leaders signed a contract, a condotta, to provide a certain number of soldiers. The men, the condottieri, came with their own weapons and armor, and usually fought for as long as they were paid. If the funds did not come for some reason, they were quite capable of stopping in the middle of a campaign, even during a battle, and holding their employer to ransom. When campaigning, which usually took place in the dry summer months, finished, the condottieri often roamed around the countryside, helping themselves to whatever they could lay their hands on. Like a gang leader, today, with his boastful tattoos, one condottieri captain proudly bore the motto on his breastplate: "Enemy of God, enemy of piety, enemy of peace." Machiavelli loathed the mercenaries as dangerous parasites on the body politic and urged Italian rulers to institute militia made up of civilians who would be imbued with the right sorts of virtues and have true loyalty to their city and, equally important, be well-disciplined and well-trained. The challenge, he discovered, and it is a perennial one, is how to take civilians, farmers, shoemakers, office clerks, or schoolteachers, and make them into a cohesive body of troops, prepared to obey orders and endure hardship, and be ready to kill and be killed. Like many of his contemporaries, Machiavelli consulted the classical writers. Victory in war, said the much-admired Vegetius, does not depend entirely upon numbers or mere courage. Only skill and discipline will ensure it. The Romans, he went on, conquered the world because they were continually training their troops. They maintained strong discipline, and they took the arts of war seriously. Without these, what chance would the inconsiderable numbers of the Roman armies have had against the multitudes of the Gauls? Or with what success would their small size have been opposed to the prodigious stature of the Germans? The Spaniards surpassed us not only in numbers, but in physical strength. We were always inferior to the Africans in wealth, and unequal to them in deception and stratagem. And the Greeks, indisputably, were far superior to us in skill, in arts, and all kinds of knowledge. In societies such as the Roman, the prevailing culture had already partly prepared young men to become soldiers. In other times and places, however, the hold of civilian society over recruits has had to be firmly severed, symbolically and literally, before they can be molded into good soldiers. Taking off civilian clothes and putting on uniforms, standardized haircuts, and living in barracks all mark the passage from one world to another. Old loyalties to family, friends, or communities must be superseded by newer ones to the regiment, the ship, or the squadron standards. The bronze or silver eagles the Roman legions carried, for example, flags. Stories of past triumphs or defeats are part of a new shared identity. When the Emperor Augustus recovered 2 Roman eagles which had been lost to the Parthians, he built a temple to house them and struck a coin in their honor. In the 16th century, the fearsome German mercenary companies, the Landsknechts, greeted new members with an elaborate, quasi-religious ceremony. The recruits passed under an arch made from halberds and pikes for their enrollment, which included the inscribing of their names on a register and their acceptance of their first pay. They then listened to a reading of the fierce discipline code and took an oath to accept it. To keep their memories fresh, gallows drawn or actual marked off their territory, and the gallows would be used. Military discipline has always depended in large part upon fear of punishment, from being confined to barracks to execution. From the ancient Greeks to the Iroquois, the military have used the gauntlet, with the victim running between his fellows as they strike at him. Prussian officers beat their men with the flats of their swords, while the Spanish used the ramrods from their muskets. For centuries, the British Army and Navy used the cat-o'-nine tails, which could lay a man's back open. The future Admiral Jackie Fisher fainted as a 13-year-old cadet when he saw his first flogging. While the sorts of crimes soldiers can be accused of have changed, if blasphemy were still one, most Western barracks would be largely silent. Some remain remarkably consistent across time and space. Failure to obey orders, losing one's weapon, and desertion are all a threat to order and unity, and that is particularly dangerous in battle. A soldier, said Frederick the Great, must fear his officer more than the enemy. In a very different time, a very different man, the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky said much the same thing. A soldier must be faced with the choice between a probable death if he advances and certain death if he retreats. Like many others before and since, Trotsky's Red Army used summary executions on the battlefield, as did the Soviet armies in the Second World War. In 1941, William McNeill, a young American who had been drafted along with millions of others, encountered another equally ancient way that the military make individuals into soldiers. On a dry and dusty Texas plain, he had to submit to endless drilling as an illiterate non-com shouted orders. A more useless exercise would be hard to imagine. Years later, McNeill, by now a distinguished historian, realized that he remembered the drill with something like affection. Words are inadequate to describe the emotion aroused by the prolonged movement in unison that drilling involved. He felt, he recalled, a sense of well-being and pleasure at being part of a collective ritual with his fellow soldiers. Marching became an end in itself. Moving briskly and keeping in time was enough to make us feel good about ourselves, satisfied to be moving together, and vaguely pleased with the world at large. In our individualistic contemporary societies, we laugh at and deplore the turning of humans into automatons, as in the mass gymnastics in Pyongyang, or soldiers goose-stepping at military parades. But we also admire the teamwork that sends a rowing 8 gliding across the water or a corps du ballet across the stage. McNeill eventually wrote a book about the importance of what he named muscular bonding. Drill and discipline together create the warriors who will obey orders and perform tasks together like trained athletes and dancers, even in the most difficult of circumstances. "It is only wonderful," said Wellington of his Scum of the Earth, "that we should be able to make so much out of them. We may deplore the very notion of training that turns men into parts of a greater machine, with their muscles automatically carrying on. But it is necessary if they are to function in battle. Having a clear task, as sailors do on their ships, for example, can keep panic at bay. Training and discipline also make the military do what is unnatural in risking their own lives and taking those of others. When discipline and training fail and units lose cohesion, not only are they less of a threat to the enemy, but they become vulnerable at the Battle of Antietam. The 16th Connecticut Infantry Regiment, which had only been organized a month before, was set into combat with virtually no training. Its men barely knew how to fire their weapons, and indeed, they had only learned how to load them the previous day. The 16th's men did not know how to march or to wheel about as a body, something which is difficult in the best of times, but especially on the battlefield, and their officers did not yet have either the authority or the knowledge to command them. When they were attacked on their flank through the tall stalks of corn by the toughened and experienced Confederate soldiers, there was chaos. The 16th officers, as inexperienced as the men, had no idea what to do. One said desperately to his colonel, "Tell us what you want us to do, and we'll try to obey you." The men simply panicked and fled. A Confederate soldier described a crowd of terrified Union soldiers at the bottom of a hill in a crouching, disorderly line, unable to move. "We poured into them," he said, volley after volley, doubtless with terrible execution. The 16th lost 25% of its strength that day. Military hierarchy, cohesion, and strong morale can bring their own dangers. In October 1943, an officer spoke to a group of his men. "Most of you will know what it is like when 100 corpses lie together, when there are 500, or when there are 1,000. And to have seen this through, and apart from exceptional cases of human weakness, to have remained decent has made us hard, and is a page of glory never mentioned, and never to be mentioned." The speaker was Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's devoted lieutenant and head of the Nazis' own military, the Schutzstaffel, or SS, which was responsible for their worst atrocities. His audience were SS officers in German-occupied Poland, and the page of glory he was talking about was the extermination of Europe's German. While some soldiers come to enjoy the sadistic pleasure of torturing and killing the helpless, others simply treat it as a job to be done. A strong sense of comradeship and a willingness to follow orders which make men fight and endure together can lead to systematic, organized cruelty and evil. Ordinary men is what the historian Christopher Browning entitled his study of a German police battalion that massacred Jews in Poland. Some were anti-Semites, but most seem simply to have been obeying orders. The men were given the option to transfer out of the battalion if they found the task too hard. Of 500, fewer than a dozen left. In 1944, an SS company went to the small French town of Oradour-sur-Glane and killed everyone, men, women, and children. They could find later giving as an excuse the fact that the town was heavily involved in the resistance. Some 642 died, even though the SS had not found any evidence of resistance activity. One of the SS killers later said to another German veteran, speaking as one old SS man to another, Herr Müller, "It was nothing. In Russia, we did such things every day. The ruined village has remained empty ever since as a memorial to that dark time." We cannot take comfort, however, in the fact that the ordinary men of the police battalion or those in the SS were Nazis. Even the military from good democratic regimes with strong liberal values are capable of committing atrocities. One of the perennial challenges facing even those societies that deplore such wanton violence is to make their military into killers, but controlled ones. The delicate balance is between training recruits to overcome the normal human inhibitions against killing. Otherwise, they will not be useful in combat and reining them in from going too far. War has its own laws, and one of the oldest and most persistent is that those who have surrendered, and civilians, where possible, should be spared. Yet we all know the stories or have seen pictures of the sacking of cities, the execution of prisoners of war, the shelling of churches filled with refugees, or the farm buildings deliberately set on fire. And we remember names such as Orador or Wounded Knee or Nanjing. For any American who lived through the Vietnam War, the incident at My Lai, when a representative group of ordinary American soldiers rampaged through a village, has come to represent the barbarism of much of that war. The Vietnamese forces committed their own atrocities, but Vietnam has been slow to come to terms with them. In 1968, American reporters in the country started to hear stories about the murder in cold blood of some 500 villagers of all ages by an American patrol. One courageous helicopter pilot who was there did his best to save the Vietnamese and later filed a report with his superiors who did nothing. Senior officers in Vietnam and later in Washington did their best to cover the incident up. In 1969, one of America's most respected journalists, Mike Wallace, interviewed Paul Meadlow, one of the soldiers responsible, who admitted freely that he had fired at point-blank range into helpless civilians. "And you killed how many?" asked Wallace. "It was hard to tell," replied Meadlow, "because with an automatic rifle, you just spray the bullets about, possibly," he added, 10 or 15 men, women, and children. "Yes," said Meadlow. "And babies," said Wallace. "And babies." Meadlow's mother, who was interviewed by Seymour Hersh, who had first broken the story, said of her son, "I gave them a good boy, and they sent me back a murder."